the Italian Renaissance, the stuff we learned back in chapter 13 months ago, that was like the beginning of the year. We don't remember any of that. So, here is the video that has been assembled by your resident Elena Lopez and Olivia Booth to help you remember that stuff. So, here we go. Starting with events. The War of the Roses was a civil war in England between the two noble factions of the House of Lancaster and York between 1455 and 1485, fought over the throne of England. The victory went to a member of the House of Lancaster. Henry Tudor took the kingship and married Edward IV's daughter to unite the houses of Lancaster and York. It began the House of Tudor, which ruled England for 117 years. It led to the end of private armies and a reduction of political power held by the noble houses in England. Inquisition, more specifically the Roman Inquisition. In 1542, the papal bureaucracy was strengthened to root out dissent in the Catholic Church. This was part of the Catholic Reformation in response to the decline of the Catholic Church due to the spread of Protestantism. It ended in 1834. It suppressed the intellectual life of Italy and contributed to the end of the Italian Renaissance in 1600. The Italian Renaissance. This lasted from the late 14th century to 1600. It was the birth of the Renaissance, literally meaning rebirth, era. It involved renewed interest in Roman and Greek classics as a moral compass, and humanism was prominent. The Renaissance classicism dominant at the time focused on perspective, realism, and movement away from religious themes. Northern Renaissance. There was a spread of the Renaissance to the rest of Europe from the late 15th century to 1648. One of the most well-known aspects of it was Christian humanism. The art was extremely lifelike, this style being especially strong in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, and England. The northward spread of the Renaissance was key in the development of Protestantism. The Black Plague was a major plague from 1348 to 1351 that killed upwards of 40% of the European population. It also weakened feudalism. Moving on to ideas. Humanism was a prominent intellectual movement in the Renaissance, originating with Petrarch in the 14th century. It composed of classicism, secularism, individualism, and a desire for human control of the environment. Individualism was an aspect of humanism. It thought that humans should focus on learning, and human affairs should concern them. Secularism was an aspect of humanism. It encouraged humans to concern themselves with the present rather than the afterlife, although the church still played a central role. Classicism was another aspect of humanism. It was the study of Greek and Roman classics to teach morals. Christian humanism was humanism with the classicism influence. It was focused on the Bible and early Christian documents. It led to the Protestant Reformation. And now moving on to my part, people. Albrecht Dürer was a German artist during the time of the Renaissance period that lived from 1471 to 1528. He was born in the city of Nuremberg, a strong artistic center in Europe. Nuremberg was, in fact, the center of the German Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. While he was a painter, draftsman, and writer, his most significant artistic impact came from printmaking. He was the one who revolutionized printmaking into an independent art form by expanding its tonal and dramatic range. He specialized in relief prints, such as woodcuts, and intaglio-type prints. He was influenced by the artistic practices and philosophical interests of Italy, visiting the country twice and absorbing the Renaissance culture. He was also in contact with many of the most prominent figures in German society. He was the official court artist to Holy Roman Emperors Maximilian I and Charles V. He was also exposed to brilliant theologians and scholars such as Erasmus and Melanchthon. His most famous works were a series of religious woodcuts: The Apocalypse in 1498, the Large Woodcut Passion Cycle in 1497 to 1500, and the Life of the Virgin, which was begun in 1500. His other significant works include the Apocalypse woodcuts. Night, Death, and the Devil in 1513, St. Jerome in a Study, 1514, and Melancholia I, 1514. Francesco Petrarch was born in Arezzo in 1304 and lived until 1374, being an Italian poet and humanist. He was pressured into the law career by his father and, being disinterested, instead devoted himself to belles lettres. Eventually, he left the field to study the classics and begin a religious life. His love for Latin literature grew as he traveled, serving under Cardinal Colonna for ecclesiastical orders, and he was able to share his love for the humanities with Giovanni Boccaccio, a fellow poet and humanist. He continued performing diplomatic missions for the church, traveling around Europe and becoming a well-known scholar and poet. His poems investigate the connection between love and chastity in the context of a political landscape and use Italian forms such as terza, rima, beate, sestine, and canzoni. He wrote many sonnets focusing on his love for Laura. He was most famous for the 317 sonnets that he kept in his Canzoniere songbook. He was considered the father of humanism and coined the term the Dark Ages. Leonardo da Vinci lived from 1452 to 1519 and was a Renaissance painter, sculptor, inventor, and draftsman. He was also greatly concerned with the laws of science and nature, which significantly impacted his work. He had 13,000 pages of notes and drawings consisting of observations and inventions like designs for flying machines, plant studies, war machinery, anatomy, and architecture. He has some of the first drawings on record of the fetus in the uterus, the heart and vascular systems, the sex organs, and other bone and muscle structure. He was often commissioned for religious paintings, such as his famous The Last Supper, commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici. He also painted the incredibly famous Mona Lisa, completed at some point between 1505 and 1507. He was not only significant for being one of the greatest scientific minds of the Italian Renaissance, but also having a strong influence on future artists such as Raphael and Michelangelo. Niccolò Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1427, being born in Florence, Italy. He became a man who lived his life for politics and patriotism. He is associated with corrupt, totalitarian government as a result of his pamphlet called The Prince. This was written to gain influence with the ruling Medici family in Florence in order to return to politics by writing this book on what he thought were the Medici's goals and dedicating it to them. The Prince was a political treatise that claimed to be one of the first works of modern philosophy. It is a practical guide for ruling directed towards Lorenzo. It discusses power politics, warcraft, and popular goodwill. He argues that obtaining the goodwill of the state is the best way to maintain power. Unfortunately, many ended up disagreeing with his political viewpoint and seeing his writing as evil. He is significant for being one of the founding fathers of political science and leading to the term Machiavellian politics. Erasmus was a Dutch humanist born at Rotterdam in 1466, living until 1536. He received his influence of humanism when he was sent to the school of humanist Hegius at Deventer. He was forced into a monastery school when his mother and father died. He calls the years spent there his 2 lost years, characterizing it as the development of his religious indifferentism and weakness of character. He was, however, free to pursue his studies and devoted himself to the ancient classics. Eventually, during a trip to England, he met Oxford of Calais, who showed him how to reconcile the ancient faith with humanism by abandoning the scholastic method and devoting himself through the study of scriptures. He joined a circle of scholars, editors, and printers traveling through Europe. His first published work was the Adagia in 1500, which was a collection of Greek and Latin proverbs from the classics. Following that was The Praise of Folly in 1509, which criticized the Church. He advocated reform of the Church on the basis of the study of sacred text. He believed what the Church needed was not institutional reform, but true religion. He was the first to publish the New Testament in Greek in 1519. He translated many other Greek and Latin works, and also wrote a large amount of letters. He was important for being the most famous and influential humanist of the Renaissance. And now, finally, we come to the five, etc., I guess. Why does Mona Lisa look so smug? Oligarchies. An oligarchy is the type of government in which political power rests with a small, elite segment of society. In most classic oligarchies, governing elites were formed exclusively from the lineage of the hereditary ruling caste, whose members tended to exercise power in the interests of their own class. This term has also been used synonymous with aristocracies, which were ruled by members of a noble class, or with plutocracies, ruled by the wealthy members of the community. In the case of Renaissance Italy, cities that were oligarchies meant that they were under the rule of merchant aristocracies. Oligarchies were formed when narrow qualifications for citizenship were established by the popolo, the leading group at the time, who practiced political exclusivity. They were overthrown to be replaced by oligarchies. Oligarchic regimes possessed constitutions, but through a variety of schemes, a small, restricted class of wealthy merchants exercised the judicial, executive, and legislative functions of government. The printing press. Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1445, which caused a massive impact on literature at the time. Prior to the invention of this device, bookmaking involved copying every word and illustration by hand. As a result, the labor of making a book was incredibly expensive, and thus a small portion of people had access to literature. Since Gutenberg's press could produce books quickly, effectively, and with relatively little effort, bookmaking became far less costly, and many people could now have access to books. As the demand for books grew, more genres became available, and the industry of bookmaking flourished. Even more importantly, this helped spread awareness for a new philosophy called humanism, as Renaissance writers returned to the works of ancient authors. If you thought I wasn't going to use the silliest picture I could find for TMNT, you are horribly, horribly wrong. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named after the artistic masters of the Renaissance: Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Donatello. Leonardo da Vinci, born 1452, died 1519. His most famous works are the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, two oil paintings. He had incredible technical and manual skills, and had a nature that was careful and precise in his paintings. He was also an intellectual, leaving behind detailed drawings of the human anatomy, plans for a flying machine, and ideas on the construction of multi-level canal and road systems. Due to being both an artist and scientist, he was characterized as the ultimate Renaissance man. Raphael, born 1483, died 1520. He was popular with the popes of the period, designing the papal apartments of Julius II and eventually becoming the architect of St. Peter's. He is credited with revolutionizing portrait painting due to the style he used in his portrait of Julius II. He also designed the cartoons on the tapestry of the Sistine Chapel. He reflected the interest in classical influence in paintings such as the School of Athens, but also paid tribute to those who inspired him by portraying them as philosophers alongside Plato and Aristotle. Michelangelo, born 1475, died 1564. He created many of the works that are commonly associated with the Renaissance, such as the frescoes that adorn the Sistine Chapel, including the Last Judgment. He was also a sculptor, creating two of the world's greatest statues, David and Pieta. Donatello, born in 1386, died in 1486. He was a sculptor that brought dramatic shapes to a striking level of liveliness and powerful expression. He was also one of the earliest artists working with the idea of perspective. He is known partially for his work with bas relief, a form of shallow relief sculpture that, in Donatello's case, incorporated significant 15th century development in perspective illusionism. His works include Marble St. George, made for the Guildhall of Orsa-Michel, the gilt bronze St. Louis of Toulouse at the Church of Santa Croce, Florence, and his bronze relief of the Feast of Herod and statuettes of angels on the baptismal font in the Baptistery of Siena. Miser, Spider, Fox. Fables originated with Aesop, who was born a slave around 620 BC. The fables of Aesop passed into the medieval tradition through the Latin version by Phaedrus, a Roman slave from the 1st century AD. Phaedrus's work became popular during the Renaissance, thus spreading the popularity of fables during this time period. The fables taught lessons through animal characters. In the interest of saving time, since I already kind of passed the 15-minute mark, I'm not going to read out the Aesops, but I will put them here, and you can pause the video if you're really dead set on reading them. The Court of the Star Chamber, formed in 1487, was a supplement to common law courts in England. It drew its authority from the king's sovereign power and its privileges and was not bound by the common law. Its purpose was to oversee the operations of lower courts and hear cases by direct appeal. Most of the cases heard by the Star Chamber involved property rights, trades, government administration, and public corruption. The Star Chamber was the primary court that administered punishment to those convicted of libel, the crime of speaking too freely about persons or state affairs. The main advantage of the Star Chamber was that it offered quick and effective resolution to legal conflicts. It was popular during the reign of the Tudor kings for its ability to enforce the law when other courts were plagued by corruption. Under the Tudors, the Star Chamber hearings were public matters, so proceedings and verdicts were subject to inspection and ridicule, which led most judges to act with reason and justice. Was that the last one? It's over! Nah, I'm just kidding. You didn't think I'd end it without bloopers, did you? Due to the spread of Protestantism, Catholic Church, due to the spread of Protestantism. It ended in 1832-34. Key in the development of Protestantism, to the spread of Protestantism, totters. I'm gonna Google how to pronounce this.
Protestantism.
Protestantism?
Protestantism.
That makes sense. Wait, what about this one?
Protestantism.